One thing that Pastor talked about last Wednesday for Bible study in preparation for, the Easter season, he talks about how in the original Passover, they were instructed to find the sacrificial lamb, and that lamb was to live with them, to abide with them, to establish that intimacy. That's what God wants. That's what God wants. He wants us to have that level of intimacy with him to where we know him. He knows us. We understand him. He already understands us. Okay? So that intimacy is what we're looking for. So as we grow spiritually, that intimacy ought to grow. You can't grow intimate apart from one another. Have you ever known anyone or yourself been in a long-distance relationship? As much as the two of you may want it to work, it's not going to work, because that part of the relationship, that intimate knowledge that you need to have with one another, you can't do it apart from each other. And so if you're going to grow together, if you're going to grow intimately, and that's not just sex for adults, it's that closeness, that just knowing. Men have to learn what intimacy is. We're not born with that knowledge. We have to learn that intimacy is being close enough to listen. Close enough to where you feel that I'm listening and understanding. Okay? Now, your second homework assignment was to find the 5 benefits of having an intimate relationship with God. And we can find these together. Now, look on page 9, the second paragraph. What's the first benefit of being intimate with the Lord? Fruitfulness in our lives. Give it to me in plain English. What does it mean to be fruitful in our lives? Sister Wesley, if you're fruitful, tell me what that means. Morning.
If you're fruitful, you're going to bring others.
Okay. If you're fruitful, that means your fruit is other people that you bring to the Lord. I'll take that. What else does it mean to be fruitful? If you have fruit, if you have spiritual fruit in your life, what are you telling me? You got chapter 2, right? Okay, if I'm a farmer and I'm farming, okay, and I tell you, you know what? I had a fruitful season this year. What do I have?
You made a profit. You have a big yield.
Okay. Would you consider me successful?
Yes.
All right. So fruit in our lives is success. We can have natural success, whether it be our jobs, our family, whether it be in our personal lives, our relationships, our schooling. We can have spiritual success. For example, we had a T-chart last week, and you listed ways that we can grow spiritually. Then I asked you, well, what are some things you intend to do that you're going to do in order to grow spiritually? And you listed some things as well. One of the things that we notice is what you say you're going to do is more specific. And those goals usually come with some sort of timeline, or at least you can tell what the frequency is. For example, what's one way we can grow spiritually? We can pray. Well, what are you going to do to grow spiritually in terms of your prayer life? I'm going to pray when I wake up and before I go to sleep. So if I were to ask you, well, how many times do you pray? You can at least tell me, I pray twice a day. How many times do you pray in a week? I pray 14 times a day. That has some level of specificity. Yeah. So you can put a number on that. You can quantify that. You can tell me how successful you've been that week. If you prayed 10 times that week and your original goal was 14, can't you kind of express to me how successful you were? If your goal was to pray 14 times a week and you only made it twice, can you tell me how successful you are? Of course you can. So the benefit of being intimate with Christ is that we will bear fruit. And that fruit can be things in the natural and things in the spiritual. But now this course is growing towards spiritual maturity, so we want to bear some spiritual fruit. Sometimes you can plant something and that thing will produce. And sometimes other things will produce right along with it. And and a very simple reason, because like I said, I'm not a scientist or whatever, I talk English. But one thing I know is sometimes seeds have a way, depending on the chemicals in the ground, some of the elements that are there, something happens to the seed. It can transform, and it changes. And so when you thought you were coming up with this, you may get that, but you're going to get something else too. Or your yield is different than what you thought it looked like. Okay? And so you talk about bearing fruit. There are different types of fruit that may come up. For example, if you say that I want to grow spiritually in my prayer life, and so therefore I'm going to increase how often I pray. Well, guess what? After you look back after a couple of weeks, you may say, you know what? I can tell that I've grown because I'm praying as I said I was going to pray. That's fruit. Your fruit is more prayer. But how many of you know that there's more fruit that you can bear if you're praying more often? What can happen if you start praying like you said you're going to pray? Do you ask for stuff in your prayer? Of course. So, your prayers might be getting answered. Is that not fruit also?
Yes.
What if you feel closer to God after you've been praying more often? Is that not more fruit? If we go to John, he'll tell you. In the book of John chapter 15, I believe Jesus said, I would that you bear much fruit. So, my growing, my spiritually maturing Christians, and that's all of us, at least it should be, when you start to get closer to God, becoming more intimate, and when you start growing and doing those things that you know to do, and doing those things you said you're going to do, you'll start to bear fruit. And one thing that we can take from this is when you start to bear fruit, that gives you the potential to bear more fruit. And as you continue to mature and you bear more fruit, then you'll get to that place where God wants you to be, where you'll bear much fruit. So, if you want to add a note to your lesson here, John 15, there are different levels of mature Christians. There are those that bear fruit, there are those that bear more fruit, and there are those that bear much fruit. And we can sit and say, well, what's the difference between much and more? Obviously, there's a difference. If I was to pull out my English background, much and more are what we call indefinite pronouns. It refers to a quantity, but we can't definitively say how much it is. But what we can take from it in the spiritual is that there's a different level from those that bear fruit, those that bear more fruit, and then there's those that bear much fruit. And we want to bear much fruit.